Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guest, Steve Taylor. And he's here today to share with us his new book, The Clear Light, Spiritual Reflections and Meditations. So have you ever wondered if poetry can elevate your consciousness? As Eckhart Tolle has written, poetry has been recognized since ancient times as a highly appropriate medium for the expression and transmission of spiritual truth. Today, our special guest, Steve Taylor, is here to share with us his new book, The Clear Light, which is an Eckhart Tolle Edition. Now, many of you will remember Steve Taylor. He's been on the show before. He's a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University and the author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality. He's the current chair of the transpersonal psychology section of the British Psychology Society. His articles and essays have been published in over 50 academic journals, magazines, and newspapers. So let's welcome to the show, Steve Taylor.
Hi, Marianne. Great to be with you.
What an honor it is to have you again here and talk about this new book. I am so excited. So what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it was a gradual process, really. I wrote the book over a period of 5 years. So it's really a sort of collection of moments of inspiration which occurred over a long period of time. So I think the theme which connects them is that they all emerge from, higher states of consciousness, moments of awakening. So they're all kind of glimpses into the awakened state, and they're all insights which appear in that state.
Well, how exciting is this? I know this is the third book that you've published with New World Library. And so what has initially inspired you to even follow the spiritual path that you're on?
It wasn't really a decision. It was an organic process. I think it was in me from birth, really. Maybe from, before birth, maybe in another lifetime. But it was something I became aware of when I was very young, perhaps 16 years old, 17 years old. Then I began to have what I would now recognize as spiritual experiences. Although at the time, back then, I didn't understand them. And I thought I was maybe crazy. So I knew that I shouldn't tell other people about them because other people would think I was crazy. And I had a sense that I might end up being sent to see a psychiatrist because other people wouldn't understand me. But it was only later on, a few years later, when I began to read books on spirituality and mysticism, I began to recognize my own experiences and thought, wow, maybe I'm not crazy after all. Or maybe I am, but lots of other people are crazy too.
I would fall in that category.
To be crazy. But,
I'm glad that you talk about that because I think a lot of people, when they first go through any type of spiritual awakening or spiritual process, there can be this feeling of, gosh, I may need a padded room, when in a sense, it's really just opening to a different level of consciousness.
That's true. I mean, the problem is that in our society and sort of Western cultures in general, there's not much understanding of these states. And we tend to view, well, not us, but our culture in general views non-ordinary states of consciousness in toto as aberrational. So anything which is non-ordinary is seen as pathological. So that applies to higher states of consciousness and states of psychosis. They're kind of linked together, grouped together as the same thing. So I think it's changed a little bit over the last 20 years or so. I think there is more understanding of spiritual states and of higher states of consciousness in general. But it depends. I mean, if you're lucky enough to be born into a family with some knowledge of these things, then you'll probably be okay. But, if you're born into a kind of a secular family, which doesn't, have much experience of alternative ideas or spiritual ideas, then you may have to seek out understanding yourself, which can be a long process.
Well, thank goodness we have great spiritual leaders such as yourself that can help people kind of navigate that path. And so, it has me kind of thinking, I mean, your book's titled The Clear Light. What does that mean? Why did you name your book that?
It has two meanings, really. One meaning is the clear light of the present. So there are a few pieces in the book where I talk about, when we live in the future or in the past, when our minds are filled with anticipations of the future or goals for the future, or memories about the past, or feelings based on past experiences like guilt or bitterness or frustration because of past experiences, then there's a sense that, we become clouded over. Our minds become foggy with concepts, and we can't see the world clearly. We're filled with this fog of abstraction, which stops us seeing the world clearly. But when we live in the present, everything fades away. The future and the past fade away. The haziness of thoughts fades away, and there is nothing but the pure, direct experience of being in the moment. And everything is clear. Everything is clear in the present, whereas everything is foggy in the future or the past. So that's one meaning, that when we give our whole attention to the present, then we exist in the clear light of the present. And the second meaning, this is a reference which occurs in a couple of other poems, is that the clear light is also the essence of our being. Then there is a radiance at the essence of our being, and we sometimes become aware of that when our minds are very quiet, perhaps in a deep state of meditation, or it could happen quite randomly when we're maybe walking in the countryside, feeling quite relaxed. It could happen in any situation where we switch into a higher state of awareness and we tune into the essence of our being. Then we become aware of a kind of a rich radiance shining deep inside us, almost as if there is a kind of golden core of our being. So the clear light is also the golden radiance of the essence of our being.
Oh my goodness, I love that. And it's so true when you look at who and what the core of ourselves are. That being connected to that is such a powerful thing. I think a lot of times people, they need a little help getting that connection in place.
That's true. I think a lot of people seek that connection even without being aware of it. I remember a few years ago, I was on the beach and I looked into the distance and I saw lots of sort of small black figures in the water. And I thought, are they birds? Are they seals? But I walked close and realized they're all surfers. There were like dozens of surfers in the water. And I thought, what are people seeking when they go surfing? They're seeking exhilaration, the feeling of connection to nature, the feeling of connection to the water, the feeling of challenge and overcoming obstacles and riding a bigger wave. But I think they're also seeking nowness. They're seeking a connection to the essence of their being. They're seeking a clear mind. I think there are lots of activities that people, practice. Could be climbing, walking in the countryside, also extreme sports like paragliding or bungee jumping. I think people, they're actually seeking a clear mind. They're seeking presence. Whenever you're in a situation of danger or a situation of close contact with nature or with the elements, your mind switches off and you become one with the moment and therefore one with the essence of your being.
Getting to that oneness, I think, is where everyone wants to be. And I love how your book really helps people in many ways find how to do that. Because I think a lot of times when we talk about meditation and being in that place of stillness, it can get really confusing for new people or just people who have been doing it for a while. It's like, how do I know I'm in that space?
Yeah, I think, I'm sometimes surprised. Well, I'm not surprised anymore, but I used to be surprised by the number of people who would, they'd find that meditation actually had the opposite effect it's supposed to. Because some people would find that meditation brings out thoughts that they had suppressed or memories that they had suppressed. It actually made their minds feel more turbulent than, whereas meditation is supposed to make our minds quiet and calm. But I think one of the problems is that, there are lots of activities which are meditative in themselves, but which are not normally classed as meditation. So I sometimes recommend to people, don't practice meditation in itself, maybe that's not right for you at this moment. Maybe try a meditative activity. Try walking in the countryside. Try running. Try doing yoga. So really, any activity which slows down the mind and gives us a sense of connection to nature and to our own bodies, that is meditative. And it will slow down our thoughts. It will quieten our minds. And finally, there's a certain point when our minds become so quiet and our thoughts become so slow and soft, then we feel connection to something deeper inside us. It's a bit like, clouds slowly softening and drifting away and becoming so thin that eventually you can see the sunlight behind the clouds. So our minds are just like that. Eventually our thoughts slow down and the radiance of our true self is visible and we can feel it.
Well, I think that that's such a great place to start. And I could understand completely what you're talking about. I remember when I first started meditating, it was stressful because I kept thinking of everything. I'm like, oh, am I meditating? My mind's going 100 miles an hour. So what advice do you have for people that are starting off that are new?
Well, there's a tendency to jump in a bit too deeply for some people. So, you don't really want to start meditating for 40 minutes at a time, in completely silent surroundings. You want to take it gradually, a few minutes at a time, and then slowly build up over the days and weeks. But I think the main thing is that, it does take time to plunge into your own being. There's a poem I wrote once where I talked about how, it's like acclimatizing to a different country. At first, you go to a foreign country and it seems strange and you feel slightly uneasy, perhaps, because all the customs are so different. People are speaking a different language. The climate is different. So you feel slightly uneasy. You can't really settle down. But slowly, over days and weeks, perhaps months, slowly you begin to adjust. You begin to settle down. So you begin to acclimatize to the inner world, you could say. There's a natural process of adjustment that takes place. So if the longer you touch into the inner subjective world of your being, then the more familiar and comfortable it will become, until eventually, you'll feel completely at home there.
Oh, that's a place we all want to be. I felt that your meditations were really powerful. And the one that I really kind of resonated with, there were many, but the one that's kind of standing out in my mind right now is be gentle with your mind. And I thought, wow, what a great starting point that is.
That's true. I mean, especially in the modern world, we tend to push ourselves really hard and we expect too much of our minds. We expect them to work for 8 or 9 or 10 hours a day. Then we expect them to, organize our lives, organize our free time. We expect them to take in lots of information. So we're placing demands on our minds all the time. And, our minds they're sensitive. Like I say in the poem, they're sensitive artists. They're not machines. So you need to treat them with sensitivity. You need to be gentle with them. And especially if you rely on your mind to bring you ideas and insights and inspirations, your mind will only do that if it's treated gently. So you need to allow your mind to relax. You need to give it time off. You need to allow it to recharge and regenerate. And, just as you would, if you were relying on a sensitive artist to bring you paintings and poems and pieces of music, you would be gentle with them. You would allow them lots of free time and lots of space. So we should do the same with our minds.
That's where all the magic happens, that's where all the creativity and fun and magic takes place. And, I just felt that your book really helped people, if maybe not learn new information, but really kind of help them along their path in discovering that for themselves.
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, it's a book of guidance, partly, it's a book of guidance to myself. I in a lot of the pieces, I refer to you, I refer to the reader. But in some cases, I'm actually referring to myself. I'm actually talking to myself. I'm actually telling myself to be gentle with my mind because I place as many demands on my mind as other people do. I expect my mind to write books, to reply to dozens of emails every day. I expect my mind to mark essays, to mark students' essays at my university. But I need to give my mind some time off and allow it to regenerate. So yeah, I hope it's a book of guidance for people.
So how were you led to develop these different meditations? How did that come to be?
Again, it was a very organic process. It wasn't something which I consciously decided. What happened was that when I was going back to when I was 16, that was when I first began to have spiritual experiences, or at least I began to become conscious of them. That was also a time when I started to write poetry. I just love the feeling of putting my pen to paper and creating these descriptions of my experiences or descriptions of my surroundings. So I loved the feeling of writing poetry, and I loved reading poetry. And that continued for a few years. I was also a musician, so I used to write songs. So I loved writing lyrics as well. And, I played in bands until probably my mid-20s. But then I had a period of depression and frustration and confusion. And I stopped writing poetry. I stopped writing songs. And that continued for perhaps 10 years. Not the depression and confusion, but the cessation of writing poetry and songs continued. I didn't write any poems for about 10 years. And I thought it was over. I didn't consider the idea of writing poetry again. I thought it was just something I'd done in my youth and, kind of adolescent poetry. But when I was about 35, which I'm 53 now, so we're talking about, 15, 20 years ago, we went, my wife and I started a family, and it was a very stressful time. We had 2 young babies quite quickly. I think when the second baby came along, our first one was only 18 months. So it was a very stressful time with 2 very young children. We weren't getting a lot of sleep. There were some health problems. I had some health problems. So I got into it was quite a traumatic time, really. But at the same time, I sensed that there was a kind of deepening, which was also occurring. I felt that I was undergoing some kind of development through the difficulty and the stress. And for no apparent reason, I just started to write these meditative poems. They were poems, but they were also little meditations, reflections. And they just seemed to come from nowhere. I wasn't really conscious of them. I just had a feeling that I wanted to write them, and they emerged. And I'd read them and think, wow, that sounds good. Where did that come from? It was as if something was sort of speaking through me almost, kind of channeling in a sense. So, and ever since then, I've just carried on doing it. It almost as if something was born inside me and has continued to express itself. But every so often, I just find myself writing these reflections, these spiritual reflections and meditations.
Do you feel that it's your higher self that's actually tapping in through you and letting this flow, or is it part of a spiritual group? Where do you feel that this is coming from?
I would say it's a higher self. Although I can't be sure. I mean, what happens is that, when I'm in a relaxed frame of mind, sometimes when I'm meditating, sometimes when I'm walking in the countryside alone, sometimes when I'm on the verge of sleep, in that kind of intermediate state between sleep and wakefulness, then I sometimes, hear it's not a voice, but I sometimes get a line of a poem in my mind. It's kind of like a phrase just occurs in my mind. And I think, that'd be a good phrase for a poem. Then I get another few lines and I start to write them down. I just usually write down whatever comes. And sometimes it takes maybe 15 minutes for a whole section, a whole piece to arrive in a raw form. And then I leave it for a while, and maybe a few weeks later I come back to it and I try to sculpt those raw lines into a finished piece. So yeah, I do have a feeling that it comes from a higher self. So, but who knows? It's difficult to say where it comes from.
Well, wherever it's coming from, it's amazing. I gotta say that. So
Thanks.
you're tapped into some very high level energy, spiritual energy there. And I found it very interesting because your book with a subtitle speaks of spiritual reflections and meditations. So when we look at this, how do people use this book, and if we're talking about spiritual reflections, in what way would they use it to reflect on their spirit?
Well, one way in which people are using the book is, people often keep it by their bedside table, keep it on their bedside table, and they read one or two pieces before they go to sleep. And they find that it gives them a sense of stillness. It settles them down before they go to sleep. People are also using it at yoga groups. People often read them at the end of a yoga session, just as a way of sort of attuning to inner stillness. And people don't tend to read the book sequentially. They tend to open it at random. And people often tell me that they have a feeling that whatever they read is what they're meant to read. It helps them in that moment. So I think it's a book which people read when they need to attune to their essence, when they need a sense of stillness. And people have told me that, they do get that feeling from the book. It does give them sort of a feeling of stillness.
Well, I can definitely tell it has some high resonating energy to it. And I use it the way that you explained too. It's like, just kind of flip to a page and it really feels like it resonates with me. So I can understand why you're getting that type of feedback. What is one that you have people that are coming to you all the time saying, "Hey, I love this one. It feeds my soul today."
One of the most popular pieces is called The Alchemy of Acceptance. And I wrote that maybe 3 years ago, and I've read it quite a few times aloud at conferences and talks. And people always respond quite powerfully to it because it expresses quite a simple idea that, our view or our relationship to our life experiences is determined by whether we accept or resist them. And then the difference between acceptance and resistance is massive. So, for example, trauma, if you go through a period of trauma in your life or a period of suffering, and if you accept the suffering or the trauma, and if you let go and surrender to it, it often has a transformational effect. But if you resist the trauma, if you fight it, if you, react to it in quite an egoic, adversarial way, then it becomes more powerful. It becomes more negative. But an attitude of acceptance has the power to transform any negative experience, any seemingly negative experience. So I think when I read that poem aloud, The Alchemy of Attention, people, they relate their own life experiences to it. And it often brings about a shift from resistance to acceptance in their own lives. So experiences which they find frustrating or negative, they can, in that moment, they can transform into something neutral or even something positive just through applying what I call the alchemy of acceptance.
Oh my goodness. How powerful is that? And I think I'm going to put you on the hot seat a little bit here. Would you mind reading it to us?
Yeah, of course. Okay, there are actually two parts to the poem. One occurs right at the beginning of the book. The other is towards the end. But I'll just read the first one. Maybe I can read the other one later. This is The Alchemy of Acceptance, Part 1. Emptiness can be a vacuum, cold and hostile, dark with danger. Or emptiness can be radiant space, glowing with soft stillness. And the only difference between them is acceptance. A task may seem tedious, a chore to rush through reluctantly, or a task may seem rewarding, a process to relish with an attentive mind that reveals more richness the more present you become. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Pain may seem unbearable, searing through you from a sharp, concentrated point, so that you have no choice but to resist, to try to escape, to push away the pain. Or pain can be a sensation that you can move toward and merge with, that no longer has a center, that dissipates through your being, until it becomes soft and numb, no longer pain at all. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Trauma can break you down to nothing, destroy the identity you spent your whole life building up, like an earthquake that leaves you in ruins. Or trauma can transform you, break open new depths and heights of you, give rise to a greater structure, a miraculous new self. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Life can be frustrating, full of obstacles, with desires for a different life constantly disturbing your mind. Or life can be fulfilling, full of opportunities, with a constant flow of gratitude for the gifts you have. And the only difference between them is acceptance.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think we all needed to hear that today. There's so many people going through so many life challenges. To know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel is such an important thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think we are living through quite a tumultuous time at the moment, a time of crisis. So, that obviously creates a lot of discord in our minds. And I think acceptance can help, even in difficult situations which cause discord and chaos in our lives. Acceptance can help us to deal with them. It doesn't necessarily mean that we don't need to change anything. We may need to make changes in our lives, but still we need to accept things before we change them. Acceptance can also be the beginning of real change in our lives.
Or when change happens to us, it's not, it's something that we can become more resilient from.
That's true. Yeah. There's another poem called Be Soft, where I talk about the importance of being flexible. Whatever happens in our lives, we need to, absorb every experience. And if we make ourselves too hard, then we cause conflict. Experiences clash with us. And it creates, discord and even more conflict. But if we are soft, then we can adapt and adjust, and we can live much more easily.
Do you think that's kind of what this time in history is asking for us to do, is to be more soft with one another and especially ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, in some parts of our lives, in some parts of the world, the opposite process seems to be occurring. People seem to be becoming more divided, and more conflict seems to be, being created. But I think many people are realizing that division and conflict, they are never an answer to any situation. They just produce more chaos, more disorder. I think more and more people are realizing that we have to give way. We have to soften ourselves, and we have to embrace the other rather than being in conflict with the other. Ultimately, the only way that the human race can make any progress, and the only way in which we can ever live in harmony, is by embracing softness and accepting one another and reaching out in empathy and connection to one another, rather than in division and disconnection.
Yeah, there's so much, I don't know if it's really anger, maybe in some ways, but just there's a harshness to the energy that feels like it's at least, within parts of this country. And I think more people that reach out in compassion and kindness will help shift that energy somewhat.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the pieces is exactly about that. It's called what's it called? I forgot what it's called now. Oh yeah, Making the Human Race Whole. It's about how by bonding with one another, by connecting with one another, we actually help to make the human race whole rather than sort of splitting into different units and different separate entities. Should I read that one?
I would love for you to read that one. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's another one. I've got all these bookmarks here, of wonderful poems and meditations that I felt like really touched my soul. And that's one of them.
Yeah, I actually wrote this when I was away for a weekend at a conference in, I think it was in France. And I met so many people, and I made so many connections during this conference, not just with the people, but with the taxi drivers, the people I'd met at the airport. I was in a sort of super friendly mood, and I was being really friendly to everyone I met. I mean, I'm normally a pretty friendly guy, but I was making a big effort to be open and friendly to everybody. And I made sort of dozens of connections with people. And I was left with this feeling that, in some very small way, I'd helped to make the human race more interconnected by making all of these connections. I'd created these empathic bonds between myself and a lot of other people. And, those kind of things, they leave a residue behind. The people you affect other people, who in turn affect others. So there's a very sort of powerful effect from those tiny, interactions. So I wrote a poem about it, which is called Making the Human Race Whole. Make as many connections as you can so that this broken world can become whole again. It's your responsibility to radiate benevolence to everyone you meet, to be reckless with your friendliness, to surprise strangers with your openness on behalf of the whole human race. It's your responsibility to turn suspicion to trust, hostility to sympathy, to expose the absurdity of prejudice, to return hatred with implacable goodwill, until your enemies have no choice but to love you on behalf of the whole human race. It's your responsibility to free yourself from bitterness, to harness the healing power of forgiveness, to repair connections and re-establish bonds that were broken by resentment years ago on behalf of the whole human race. It's your responsibility to open up channels of empathy through which compassion can flow until there are so many connections across so many different networks that finally, like the cells of a body, billions of human beings will fuse together, sensing their common source and their common core. Then a new identity will emerge, an overriding oneness, and the human race will be whole at last.
I just love that. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And it just shows how much compassion and kindness can impact those around us.
Yeah, I think that, many people say that human beings are essentially selfish. A lot of economists and politicians and scientists assume that we are self-centered and that we can be cruel. And that's true. We can be self-centered. We can be cruel. But I think that the positive sides of human nature have been underestimated. I think human nature has been sold short by our economists and politicians and scientists. And I think that human beings are actually, the great majority of human beings are actually very altruistic. We are very empathic and compassionate. And we have a yearning to connect with each other. Some people, a small minority of people may be selfish and greedy and competitive. But I think most human beings have an overriding need to connect and to empathize with one another. And that's why we're capable of some amazing acts of altruism. And, on a daily basis, people are altruistic on a daily basis. And, so I think eventually we will move towards increasing connection and increasing wholeness. And I'm optimistic that divisions and conflicts will eventually fade away.
So when you wrote Rising Above, What was the inspiration behind that one? I found that one very powerful.
That was it was about creativity. It was a time in my life when there was a great deal of stress. My father was very ill. He was in the process of dying. And there was some sort of, not in my immediate family, but there were some family conflicts which I had to deal with. And my mother was also ill. So it was quite a stressful time. And I had this feeling that there were certain moments when, again, it's related to acceptance. When you're in the midst of stress, then if you move into a mode of acceptance, then it becomes bearable, and it doesn't really affect you anymore. But if you resist the situation, if you're thinking to yourself, "Oh no, why is this happening to me? When is it going to end? There's so many different things I should be doing. Why do I have to do this?" Then that just creates more discord. So I switched into a mode of acceptance, and I kind of embraced the situation. I embraced my duties, and I had the sense that I was rising above a lot of the conflicts and the stress, which were apparent at that time. And I often have that feeling that there's a certain level of everyday life which can seem stressful, and people fall out with one another. People get irritated and frustrated about trivial things. But, in our best moments, we rise above those trivial things. We rise above conflict. We rise above resentment. And it's almost as if we reach a kind of a spiritual level where life becomes purer and much more fulfilling. So it's about that, really. It's about rising above conflict and triviality.
There's so much in your book that spoke to me personally. And it's interesting, you kind of to dovetail with what we're discussing, you have a meditation that's titled Coming Down from the Mountain. And I can really resonate with that one. When I moved to Colorado, I moved into the Rocky Mountains. I was at Red Feather Lakes, high up in the Rockies. And it was me and my dog, and meditation was the key. But at some point, you have to come down from the mountain.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's great to be on the mountain,
Yeah, for sure.
It's great to live in a monastery. Not that I've never lived in a monastery. I imagine it's great to live in a monastery, so peaceful and still, and you can be so attuned to the essence of your being and live in harmony with the whole universe. But yeah, at some point, you can't live in a monastery forever. You can't live on the mountain forever. You have to come down at some point. And, that's when life gets difficult, when you come down from the mountain. That's when you're assailed by the stress of everyday life, by the discord of relationships, by the bombardment of demands and duties which the world throws on us. So, the deepest kind of spiritual wakefulness is developed in the midst of the stress and the discord. It's not developed in the stillness of the mountains. It's really tested when it's developed in the midst of everyday life. So that's, I mean, I'm not criticizing people who go to monasteries. I kind of admire them because they're putting their spiritual development as they're making it the foremost thing in their lives, which is very admirable. But but I think we really need to develop our spirituality in the midst of the messiness and the discord of everyday life. Then it becomes deeper and stronger and much more stable.
Yeah, it's interesting how that is, because everything is about relationships. And while the mountain can be so peaceful, sometimes we're actually diving into the relationship with ourselves, and once we get that right, then we've got the relationship with others that we're working on as well.
That's right. Yeah. And that can be the problem with, if you do live in a mountain or a monastery, then you neglect relationship with others. You neglect the emotional, relational aspects of life. And, so you have to have a balanced approach to spiritual or personal development. You can't focus too strongly on one area. You have to, develop your spirituality at the same time as developing your emotional life, your creativity, your intellectual life, and so on. That's the most ideal form of spiritual development, incorporates every area of life.
You have a meditation that's called the flow. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that one with us.
Well, it had quite a mundane beginning, actually. I was going on a long run. It was like a sort of 6-mile run, I think. And about a mile into the run, I was thinking, I'm not going to make this. There's no way I'm going to finish this. I was thinking of the 5 miles ahead of me. And I was already so tired. And I just kept thinking of this, the end of this run, the end of the 6 miles. I thought, I'm never going to make it. It's going to be impossible. But then, I started to focus on my surroundings. I started to look around me at the trees and the sky. And I thought, wow, this is beautiful. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to think about the end. I'm not going to think about finishing. I'm just going to enjoy the journey. I'm just going to enjoy the run. So I stopped thinking about the destination. I stopped thinking about the future. I just focused on the nowness of the journey, of the run. And after a while, I felt this kind of flow arise inside me. I felt I was latching onto this flow, and it became easy. It became effortless. And, eventually I finished the run without too much effort, without too much struggle. And I thought this is a really good metaphor for life itself. That we undertake challenges or journeys, and we often, get into difficulties because we think too much about the destination. We think ahead rather than thinking about the now. But if we focus on the nowness without thinking about the end or the future, then we latch onto the flow of the journey. Every journey has a certain flow, and the flow carries us forward, so we don't really need to make an effort.
You share in many of these meditations, about being in the present moment. What does that look like for you?
For me, it looks fantastic and beautiful because it means that, whenever I'm living in the moment, whenever my attention isn't occupied by tasks or duties or distractions, and I'm just giving my attention to the isness of my surroundings, then everything becomes interesting and beautiful. And I notice a lot more things. There's a piece in the book where I talk about walking to the shops. I think it's called the strangeness. And I talk about, walking to the shops and noticing all of these small things, like noticing the shadows of railings and fences and gates on the pavement, noticing the reflections, the sunlight reflecting off the windows of cars, and noticing the patterns of bricks on the houses. And everything looks so interesting and beautiful. And that's just because, I'm paying attention. I'm giving my full attention to the nowness of my experience. So my mind is empty. There's no abstraction in my mind. There's just pure perception. It's a bit like being a child again. I think children have that incredible, I think to be a child is an incredibly exhilarating experience because children are so, their perception is so vivid and so fresh. Everything is so real to them. So to me, being in the present means living in a beautiful and exhilarating world.
What advice would you give our listeners and our readers if they're looking to develop, just being in the present moment more often? Because I think a lot of times people get a little confused about what that might look like.
Well, I have a little method which is based on a concept which I call the 3 A's. And I talk about this in one of my other books called Back to Sanity. And the 3 A's are 3 states of being in which human beings can live. So 3 states in which we spend our time, while we are alive. And the first one is abstraction. So that's when we give our attention to our thoughts, to our memories, to our anticipations of the future, or to daydreams and so on. Any kind of mental activity which we give our attention to. So we obviously spend quite a lot of our time immersed in abstraction in our own heads. And the second one is absorption. That's the second A. And that's when we give our attention to tasks or activities. When we do our jobs, we have to immerse our attention in tasks and activities. But it's also distractions, like entertainments, like giving your attention to a TV program or to a book and so on. So we spend a lot of time in absorption as well. And I think abstraction and absorption are probably the most common states in which we live, sometimes in combination. Sometimes we're partly in abstraction and partly in absorption at the same time. But the third A, the third state in which human beings can live, is awareness. And this is when we give our attention not to our thoughts, not to tasks or activities, but we give it to our experience in the present moment. So we give it to our surroundings, to the world around us right now, and also to our feelings, the sensations we have within our being right now. So what we need to do is really to spend less time in abstraction, less time in absorption, and more time in awareness. And so, you always have a choice. I think I say this in one of the pieces in the book, that we always have a choice about whether to be present or whether to be absent. And we often choose absence. We often choose, living in our thoughts, giving our attention to our thoughts, giving our attention to activities and distractions. But we can choose to be present. We can choose to just give our attention to the objects and natural phenomena around us right now, the other people around us, and also to our own experiences right now. And when we choose awareness, when we choose to be present, it is always a pleasant experience. It's an experience of harmony and contentment. So basically, we need to choose awareness.
What a beautiful place to come from, because, excuse me, if everyone is in this place where they are just in awareness and present, they are giving the best gift they can to anybody.
Yeah, it's very simple, but it's something that we forget. We sort of, in the opposite way to children, because children do naturally spend a lot of time in awareness. They're really fascinated by the world around them. They give so much attention to simple sensory experiences. But we kind of subconsciously think, it's not really interesting. Why are these surroundings interesting? I've seen them so many times before. So we don't bother to pay attention. Even when we eat food, we don't really pay attention to it. We don't pay attention to the taste. Not very much anyway. But when we do make a conscious decision to do that, to pay attention to our sensory experiences or to our surroundings, then we realize, this is how life's meant to be. It's so simple, it's so real, and it's so beautiful.
Yeah, and what a gorgeous place to be in is just that level of awareness. And I'm so glad that you shared that with us. I understand that The Clear Light is your third book in the Eckhart Tolle Edition series that's been published by New World Library. Can you share with us a little bit about how you and Eckhart Tolle are connected?
Well, it began maybe about 15 years ago now. My first book was published 15 years ago. It was called The Fall. And it was quite a weighty book about human history. It was a book about archaeology and prehistoric history, anthropology. But it was fundamentally a book about the ego. The subtitle was, what was the subtitle? I've forgotten. Oh, yeah, The Insanity of the Ego in Human History. So when I read Eckhart's book, A New Earth, I thought, wow, this book is quite similar to mine. We're dealing with similar things about the chaos and discord that the ego has caused in human history and continues to cause in human life. So I sent a copy of the book to Eckhart, and about 6 months later, out of the blue, I got an email from his assistant saying, Eckhart really likes your book, The Fall, and he'd like to speak to you about it. He wants to help you promote it and So I spoke to Eckhart on the phone a few days later. And ever since then, we've been in contact, and I've been very grateful for the support he's given me. He's given me with my books.
Well, it really seems that in very many ways that you both are on the same wavelength, I have to say, from knowing Eckhart Tolle's work and diving into your work as well. There's a lot of just great information there for people who are looking to move their consciousness to a new level.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's about the evolution of consciousness. I think Eckhart would agree with me here that, there is a process by which consciousness evolves, and spiritual awakening is a part of that. Spiritual awakening is essentially an expansion and an intensification of consciousness. And that's really, ever since the beginning of time, material things and life forms have been becoming more conscious and more complex. They become more complex at first, and they become more conscious. So within living beings, there's a process of the expansion of consciousness right back from the beginnings of life on this planet. So we're part of that. And, I think collectively, the human race is going through a process of awakening. And, I think it's inevitable that we will go through awakening, but there are quite a few obstacles in the way. There are a lot of crises that may, affect that. So it's really a question of whether the awakening can become powerful enough so that it can overcome the obstacles and the crises that are developing.
I sure hope it is.
Yeah.
Look at that. I mean, because what's that saying? If we don't pay attention, God goes and gets a bigger hammer. So
Yeah.
I don't think we want the bigger hammer.
That's right. I'm optimistic. We've got a lot of challenges, but I think there is this flowering of consciousness. I think there is a process of collective awakening underway. And I think it's inevitable, really, but, there are lots of kind of leftover crises from the old egoic mindset, which seems to be, I think the old egoic mindset is becoming more rigid because it feels threatened. So it's creating more challenges and crises. But I'm optimistic that we will overcome them.
Well, I know when people start diving into their own spiritual path and taking that personal responsibility, that your book, The Clear Light, will help them get to a place where maybe some of these challenges aren't as difficult because they're looking at it with new perspective.
Hopefully. Yeah, I mean, one thing I've always felt is that spiritual awakening can be a challenging process. It's sometimes portrayed as a blissful and easy process, but in reality, it can be quite challenging, especially if we don't have a background in spirituality, especially if we're living in a culture which doesn't really accept or understand spirituality. It can be a challenging process, and so hopefully, this book will help people deal with that challenge.
Well, and thank goodness we're in an age where people can share, their spiritual experiences and know that there's information out there, such as your book, that can help them understand a little bit more about what's going on with them.
That's one of the good things about the internet. I think there are some bad things about the internet, but that's one of the good things about it. I had a friend, a spiritual teacher I used to visit called Russell Williams, and he died 2 years ago at the age of 96. And he underwent spiritual awakening in 1950 when he was 29 years old. And at that time, there was very little access to spiritual knowledge. He was living in England. So, in Europe, there was very little knowledge of spirituality apart from Christianity. So he found it really difficult to understand what had happened to him. He spoke to, vicars and church people, but nobody understood him. So eventually, after years of, misunderstanding, he started to think he was crazy. So he began to doubt his own transformation. And it took him 9 years to find somebody who understood him. By chance, he met a Buddhist who said to him, "Wow, this is enlightenment. You're enlightened. You're just like the Buddha." And he thought, "Wow, that's it. I'm not crazy after all." But nowadays, we wouldn't have to wait 9 years for that. Maybe we can do that in 9 days, hopefully.
Thank goodness, thank goodness for that, because that can be such a journey, and there's so much great information out nowadays. And I'm so grateful that we have your book, The Clear Light, because I found it to be very transformational for my own personal journey. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Marianne.
So, Steve, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn about all of your other books as well?
The best place is my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. And that's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. So, there are lots of poems and essays and other materials on there. And, people can contact me through the website as well.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thanks, Marianne. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Steve. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Clear Light. The Clear Light is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, it's available on Kindle, so you can download right now and get to reading. Again, if you'd like to connect with Steve, you can at stephenmtaylor.com for more information. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.